Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Managing Your Certification Program During the COVID Era and Beyond, Part 2, Managing Agility in the Face of Uncertainty. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees are in listen-only mode. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them in real time throughout the course of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded. The information contained in this presentation is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to serve as legal advice. A copy of the audio recording and slide deck will be emailed to you within 72 hours of the completion of this live presentation. I would now like to pass the presentation over to Mark and Lenora.
Hi, everyone. How's it going? Welcome back to part 2 of the series. I just want to say how excited and honored Lenora and I are again to be able to speak with you, and we definitely appreciate you taking the time to join us. Today we're going to talk a little bit about agility. Definitely because of the circumstances that we're in and the uncertainty that faces us, not just in the next 6 to 12 months, but beyond that. We felt that this was a really important topic to cover. So I'm going to turn it over to Lenore, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Mark. I thought we could move on to the first slide and talk a little bit about how we selected this topic. And we thought, there are a lot of lessons that have been learned by certifiers during this pandemic. And this is a great opportunity to start to build on those lessons learned and think about what we could improve upon the next time around. And we've learned a number of lessons. You may have other lessons you'd like to add to the list. Excuse me for a second.
Yeah, and we'd really love for this presentation to be interactive. So we welcome your questions while we're doing the presentation, and we're going to try and address them in real time as much as possible.
Thanks, Mark. So you may have some other lessons learned besides what I've got on the list, and feel free to type those in the chat box and we'll take a look and share them with the rest of the group. I think, one of the things we learned is that there are things that we didn't anticipate or that we certainly didn't plan for that had a big potential impact on our ability to sustain our organizations and sustain our programs. Certainly, I think even in the best of circumstances, folks thought that it would have been great to be able to react and get to the solutions faster. One of the things we learned, which was quite interesting, and I think it came out when a lot of people transitioned to live remote proctoring out of necessity, is we learned how quickly we could make important decisions. I think those are the types of decisions that pre-pandemic times would have taken months, if not more than a year, to come to. And also, I think a big takeaway was how important transparency and empathy was in this. And it actually proved to be an opportunity for a lot of certifiers to strengthen their relationships with their candidates and their certificants through this process. But the bottom line also is that COVID isn't the only crisis we're going to face. There was a huge study that PwC did on crises, which happened to come out before the pandemic, a very large study with 2,000 senior execs organizations, all sizes, industries, all over the world. They found they had in that sample over 1,400 that had experienced at least one crisis in the past 5 years. And so out of that, they were able to analyze a total of 4,500 crises. It's a great opportunity if you have a chance to take a look at that study. And basically, they said that we got all the lessons learned, so you don't have to through this research. And so the big takeaway is, bottom line, let's use the lessons learned to be better prepared for the next time, because there will be a next time in one form or another. And let's see if we had, nope, no further lessons learned typed in. Are you seeing?
Lenore, can I add sort of one other thing related to the unanticipated impacts?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, I think, business agility is really thrown around as a term all the time in the business world, and it's something that a lot of organizations are always, struggling to improve or to achieve. And there are some organizations out there already that sort of have a high level of agility. I think one of the bigger unanticipated impacts, though, is that although you as an organization may have been set up to be agile, your partners or your stakeholders or other groups that you work with were not. And so we saw that, we saw that specifically within the credentialing industry. We saw that problem with the test vendors who, were not able to spin up certain options as quickly as possible. We also saw that from a regulatory perspective, where the jurisdictions, the states and the local jurisdictions went the other way. Instead of being agile, they locked everything down. So, I think part of the planning moving forward is not just thinking about your own agility, but also the agility of those around you and how that's going to impact your ability to do the things that you want to do.
I think that's a great point, Mark, because, a number of certifiers pivoted pretty quickly with the live remote proctoring, only to find that there were huge backlogs, and they were going to have a different type of problem on their hands. All right, let's move on to the next and just clarify what we're talking about when we talk about agility and resilience. And I've provided you here with definitions from the American Management Association. And as Mark was saying, these are concepts that have been talked about in management circles for several years before the pandemic. And then COVID accelerated the talk about these and the research into these, but also organizations' interest in becoming more agile and resilient. You can really look at agility, agility and resilience as being two sides of the same coin, or of your capacity to manage change. And so the agility part enables you to be able to manage rapid change and be there to support early and very quick, fast recognition of opportunities and threats in your environment. And so it was your agility that enabled you to as quickly as you could, get into place live remote proctoring to be able to keep testing going on during the pandemic. But resilience is also possible. Relying on agility alone isn't going to work. Resilience is what helps to ensure the stability of the organization, not just in the face of the sudden crisis, but to continue to be able to support a very effective and timely response to the disruptions that are going on and sustain the organization through extended periods of turbulence. And the example here would be we've now been going on, I don't even know, how many months is it? I don't remember, with this pandemic. And what we know is we still have uncertainty ahead for us for perhaps at least another year. And so your resilience as an organization is going to sustain your certification business at this time. The bottom line is that you really need both the agility and resilience to be able to respond as effectively as you can to whatever's going to become your way. We can't predict the future, but we can prepare ourselves for a lot of what might come at us, regardless of whether we know it in advance or not. And if we could move to the next slide, please.
Sure. And Lenore, we have a couple of lessons learned that got shared with us. So I don't know if that's something that you want to talk about now or
sure,
you know, at some point later. So the first one was that, let's see, the organization was able to downsize their headquarters. So that, you know, I guess the lesson learned is that they don't need the physical space to operate, you know, in a fully functional way. You have to, and I know with some of my other clients, that's also been the case. They've been looking to downsize, and I think if you're able to do that, that's certainly great. Now, you know, historically, when organizations are leasing space or in some sort of other arrangement for space, it's usually been longer term because people liked the certainty of having a place, of having, you know, a specific payment schedule. But, you know, those types of things could be changing, and it seems like the world is accepting the fact that people can do their work from home, and people that are doing their work from home have found out that they can do their work from home.
And they can do it with their cats on their lap, and you can see that during a Zoom meeting now, which is actually one of the things I liked that came out of the pandemic was the informality. I think the other place where people figured out now that they've had to do it, that they could streamline, is some of the meetings they had, or they realized that they don't always have to be face-to-face now, for instance, in exam development and other things, which in the end may be very helpful in terms of getting more diverse participation in those types of meetings if people don't have to travel all the time.
Yeah, I think for folks that are sort of locked into a long-term lease right now, but are potentially considering whether that's the right option for them. I mean, it never hurts to go back to the landlord and just see what the options are. You know, we have a client that was successfully able to work with their landlord to sublease the whole space. So, you know, it's people, I think, are a little bit more understanding during these times. The landlords certainly want to find a way to work with their tenants. So, you know, it never hurts to reach out. The other lesson learned that was shared with us was an organization implemented flexibility into their exam refund policy, and that was a really that got a really great response. It looks like from their candidates in terms of a customer service perspective. And
yeah, an interesting thing is that there were a number of certifiers, actually, particularly among the American Board of Medical Specialty member boards, who, as this was going on and they knew they were going to have to make changes, surveyed their candidates and certificants and said, would you prefer that we do this or that? What would be better for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great, and a good point. And you know, I would say from a policy perspective, from a legal perspective, it's not necessarily bad to sort of make flexible revisions to your policies if you're under these kinds of extreme circumstances, right? Normally, when disputes about policies come up, the one thing to keep in mind is that the courts expect organizations to have policies that are rationally related to a legitimate purpose of the organization. So, when you're talking about maybe revising an exam refund policy for a temporary basis to help people deal with, the impact of losing their job due to the COVID-19 pandemic, or, other things under the pandemic, I mean, it's very unlikely, right, that type of thing would get challenged, and it seems unlikely that a court would have a problem with those types of temporary changes. So I think the one thing to keep in mind is be flexible, be empathetic, but also just make sure that it ties back to a legitimate reason for doing this. And certainly the COVID pandemic would seem like a legitimate reason.
Absolutely. And all of the many changes that I've heard that people have made, they have definitely all qualified as being rational and logical in the face of the pandemic. One of the Don had made a comment that the current crisis is a lesson that digital was overdue, and it reminded me that one of the things I had wanted to mention earlier is that a crisis is basically a stress test for your organization. And that's why we are examining this and looking at how you did in terms of agility and resilience and what we could maybe do next time, because this is helping us to get you better prepared for the next occurrence that should take place. So we had indicated we'd talk about 5 things that you could do to make your program more agile and resilient, and I'm going to dive into that a bit more in a minute. I want to say, though, that all the actions that I've got here do require some work to varying degrees. So there's nothing you can do in the blink of an eye, and you will need to take some time out from your day-to-day to do this. But at the risk of being cliche, I'm going to say it's a solid investment in your future. It really is. And keep in mind also, as you think about the benefits of taking that extra time to do this, that this is not just agile. Being agile and resilient is not just about crisis and disruption necessarily, but it's also about being able to respond quickly, or to be able to capitalize on good opportunities when you find them. And also, before I do the deep dive on this, I just want to say you don't have to do all of this at the same time. There are a couple of different ways you could approach it. For example, you could start with what would be the easiest for your organization to do right now. So for instance, if all you needed to do was to tweak some aspects of your governance structure or your decision-making process, maybe that's the first thing you want to start with and get it out of the way. Or you can prioritize which of these 5 things is most important for you and decide that you're going to start there and begin to work on this bit by bit. All right, Mark, you can move me forward, please. All right, so first thing I wanted to talk about is having a governance structure and a decision-making process at the top that's going to enable you to move quickly. One of the things that a number of certifiers found to be extremely helpful in the beginning of the pandemic was to empower the executive committee to work alongside senior staff to make critical decisions. As you know, it is challenging enough to get the whole board together at the spur of the moment in the best of times, much less when they themselves are all experiencing their own personal and professional chaos and crisis. So being able to go to that executive committee enabled them to be able to move a lot faster and with a lot less friction, and being able to go forward and do what needed to be done as quickly as possible. Also, when we're not in crisis and before the next one, I personally think it's important to be sure that the respective roles of the board and the oversight body and staff are understood. From the perspective of, think about it, if you've got a board that has trouble staying at the strategic level and tends to get into the weeds of day-to-day operations, this might be the time, or at some point soon, initiate a process of getting clarification on the roles and starting to guide and support your volunteers and staying within the guardrails. And often this will involve bringing in an outside governance expert who can make note and talk to your board in a way that perhaps would not be appropriate or comfortable for you to talk to them. Otherwise, if you're trying to deal with unpredictability or an acute crisis when you also have your board or oversight committee trying to get into the weeds and make every decision with you and be hands-on in doing everything, this can be very challenging, and I think, as some of you have probably experienced, really slow you down. So
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can't
Can I
be
make a quick
go ahead.
comment on that, Lenore? Yeah, I mean this is a really great point. I think one that organizations should really focus on. We see this issue all the time in terms of, you know, the board sort of not really understanding their role and you know, potentially causing log jams in the process. We always recommend that there be annual board training, and the training not only should address their roles, but also their responsibilities from a legal perspective. And, you know, we find organizations that do that seem to fare a little bit better when it comes to this issue.
All right, let's move.
We do have, Lenore, we do have two questions that sort of relate to decision making that I thought would make sense to address here. So the first one says, you know, now that we have set expectations with respect to working remotely, what happens when employers want us to go back to the office? And then I think, you know, sort of bringing the camera up from that question, you know, now in terms of how organizations have sort of made modifications or revisions to their policies, what are the expectations from candidates and other types of stakeholders moving forward? For one example, you know, live remote proctoring. We know right now is meant to be temporary. What is the prospect for organizations making that at some point, you know, a permanent change? So let me try and address this work remotely question first. You know, in terms of working remotely, it's really up to the employer to do an analysis of what is needed for a particular person and a particular position. If, you know, if it has been working, that that person has been able to be productive and do all of the things that their position requires from, you know, remotely, then it seems like it would make sense for the organization to continue to allow that, because, you know, we know how hard it is to find really good staff. We don't want to spend the time training. We don't want to spend the money hiring new people simply because we can't, we can't make some sort of accommodation like remote work. However, remote work is up to the employer, and if the employer decides that what's really best is that the individual is in the office, then the individual is going to have to abide by that. And so, I think it's going to be a conversation between employees and employers, and it's going to be up to the employers to really look hard and decide how much they value their employees and what work can be done from a remote basis. Lenore, do you have any thoughts on sort of the changes that testing programs and certification organizations have made overall, and the permanency and the expectations that may be that may be set moving forward?
Yeah, well, with regard to staff, certainly one of the trends that's going on in the corporate world is the consideration that even if an organization's entire employee group is not all working virtually, there's becoming an expectation that some will be able to do that part-time, maybe a few days a week or whatever. So it may be that organizations, associations, certifiers may end up taking their lead from what's going on in the rest of the world. With respect to variations in policies, I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is I know that there are some folks that as a result of this have figured out, well, maybe we didn't need that requirement or policy to begin with. There were some that thought about, this is the time, this is something we'd been thinking about anyway. Let's test out and see what happens if we change this. It's going to make their lives easier during the pandemic, and it may turn out that we don't need to do it after that. I think, my guess is that people understand these are unique times, and I would not expect to get as much pushback, or maybe any pushback, I hesitate to say it that way, if you went back to your regular policies and procedures after this. Also, I imagine that many of you framed it as being because of the pandemic, given the unique circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure anybody had that in mind, although with respect to live remote proctoring, I think the genie may be out of the bottle there, both in terms of certifiers finding out that works well for them, and candidates liking it. So some people may choose to continue to do that.
Yeah, and then we've got one more question. It says, they've been doing their best to offer extensions for testing and recertification, but there's been a struggle to treat everyone fairly because the circumstances differ with respect to workloads, geographic location, and political environments. So, they're looking for some guidance on how to be empathetic, but also impartial. And what I would say to that is, you're not, well, first of all, when you're talking about from a legal perspective, whether a specific policy can be disputed, the one thing that courts will look at is whether a policy has been applied arbitrarily, right? So I think the word impartial is the correct word to use, and that when you're thinking about how to modify a policy or develop a policy, it should be with everybody in mind and not one specific group. So you can't please everybody. There are always going to be some folks who feel like the policy is more disadvantageous to them than others. However, as long as you're applying the policy equally to everyone, then from a legal perspective, you shouldn't have any concern about being able to use that policy as you have it. You have any thoughts on that, Nora?
No, I think that part of the empathy part is people can perceive you to be empathetic without you being able to change it or fix their immediate problem. If they feel like you are listening to them and understand what's going on. The American Board of Medical Specialties had their conference a few weeks ago, and a number of great sessions and speakers on rapid response of the boards in the time of COVID. And the executive director of the American Board of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation talked about how they made decisions in the beginning thinking that this was going to be a short-term thing, and then they had to change the decisions that they made. And I actually wrote down what she said. It's very timely that I read it. What she said was that the timeliness of the decisions was really critical, and some of our decisions were not correct. Nevertheless, coming out with something early that was definite was very, very helpful to people who were needing to get this information. When you're not communicating, it creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum comes anxiety and confusion. I think we're ready to move on to the next, and we'll continue to take questions and comments. Creating a sensing system. Now, this is really your early warning or early signaling system that becomes a permanent fixture. It's not the same thing as, for instance, when we do an environmental scan every 3 to 5 years to prepare for the next strategic plan. We're talking about implementing an ongoing process where you're going to be looking for, tracking, following what's going on out there, taking in information, analyzing it, determining its importance, and whether, what, and when to react to it. And as part of this sensing system, you would be potentially looking at things like what's going on in the larger environment. So that could be the economy, your industry. What are the innovations, changes, or challenges that are going on in higher education or adult learning? You would also potentially want to be tracking changes in customer demographics, needs, and preferences. What's happening with your customers and any potential or impending disruptive forces. So it is keeping your pulse on what's going on all of the time. And to do that, instead of having it be a periodic thing that we assemble a special group to do, this becomes really embedded. It's a day-to-day function within your organization. You've got people assigned to do it. They have resources to do it. And then there's also a back-end process where you're analyzing that information as it's coming in and looking at what you need to look at further right now. What maybe do you have to start to do what if scenarios for, all with the idea of being able to be at least proactive rather than reactive. So if for instance, if I was thinking about a sensing system for certifier, I might be at this point, for instance, keeping tabs on the start of a trend that we're seeing that could be disruption related to skills assessment. And that's the thing that's going on where Google and IBM and LinkedIn are offering skills assessments to folks independent of a credentialing body. And in some cases, they're awarding credentials based on that. That would be something that would have come up in my sensing system, and I might have said, that's something we definitely want to continue to monitor closely. Maybe it's not necessary to do a what if right now, but we definitely want to keep that on our radar screen and be thinking about it. I don't think we've had anything come up about this particular item yet. So, Mark, did you have anything you wanted to say before I move on to talking about redesigning work?
No, but it looks like we've got another question that just came in. So it says, do you have any thoughts about remote testing legal issues, best practices? Is it here to stay? So do you want to just, Lenore, talk a little bit about just going over again? It seems they missed the first couple minutes. So do you want to just go over again your thoughts on live remote proctoring? And then I'll talk a little bit about the legal issues.
Sure. This is my personal opinion. I think that it's here to stay. It's been here for a while, and some of the slowness in how accrediting bodies have looked at this and examined this and thought about this may have prevented some people from doing it. But now that they've done it and they've had a chance to experience it, they have more of a database to make a decision for themselves as to whether this is something that is appropriate for their organization and their programs. I don't think it's going away. Certainly some people will shift back to testing in bricks and mortar test centers, but I don't think the concept is going away, and I think the genie's out of the bottle, and I think we may have quite a number of certifiers sticking with it even when they don't have to anymore.
Yeah, I do agree with you though, generally that if if credentialing organizations sort of go back to the regular testing within test centers and not live, not having live remote tests, I do agree that there won't be significant pushback. There may be some, but I don't think there's going to be significant pushback yet because, it's just because we've gone to live remote proctoring doesn't mean it's necessarily worked even for a lot of folks. I know some have been happy with it, but I've also seen some where it's been quite a challenge. And so they're going to be happy to go back to testing in the test centers. Now, in terms of legal issues, there's certainly, the first one is to make sure that if you are accredited by an accrediting body, that you'll be able to continue to do live remote proctoring once we're sort of out of this, pandemic era. So, NCCA, ICE and their accrediting body, NCCA, they've allowed live remote proctoring for a temporary period. And it's not clear, what's going to happen when that temporary period ends. So, of course, you're going to have to consider that if you're going to be looking at live remote proctoring as a permanent solution. Another issue that I believe could potentially come up, I've not seen it quite yet, but I believe it's coming, is in the accommodations, in the accommodation space, whether or not people are going to try and claim remote test as an accommodation. I think that's eventually going to be requested somewhere, and I don't know what the answer to that is right now. It seems like it's going to be something that's going to have a lot of gray area.
Yeah, I can see people that have at least for the next year, that may have some pre-existing conditions or health risks may be interested in that. You know what, Mark? I've got 3 more of these 5 things that we said we were going to talk about. We're about 3/4 the way through. So
I
maybe
think we're okay on time. We're okay.
Okay. All right. So I just wanted to double check on that and move through this, make sure we get everywhere. In the meantime, we're collecting all these questions and comments that we'll be able to respond to in a few minutes. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is redesigning how the work gets done. And the first aspect of this is reducing work friction. And this is a term that Gartner has used in its research on looking at what keeps organizations from being agile and resilient and what can be done to correct it. And basically what they're talking about with work friction is the roadblocks that happen to all of us when we're trying to get things done quickly or just get things done, period, that prevent us from being more responsive. And I'll have another slide up in a minute that will show what they found to be the top causes of work friction. The other thing, which will come as no surprise to you, is simplifying workflow and hierarchies. Next one is leveraging internal and external resources, and particularly with respect to personnel. So looking at, are there resources outside of your organization that can provide extra hands when you need it, or just-in-time expertise? And in the for-profit world, more companies are beginning to develop this type of hybrid talent model. And I can see this as being something that would be particularly helpful for small staff programs. But also, let's face it, you're not going to have, none of us will have experts on board for any type of crisis that will come at us. So who is out there for us for just-in-time expertise? And maybe we can have some introductions and start a relationship with them so that they'll be there with us when we need it. They'll know who we are and they'll be there to help us out when we need it. Now, with the other big thing is empowering employees and doing that in a way that is consistent with what we might call the big A agile methodology. So when we're talking purely about agile methodologies versus a more general agility, this is a very core aspect of agile methodologies, is bringing that power and that decision-making ability down to the team and giving them resources to do what they need to do, and for them to be able to use the resources in the way they want to be able to use the resources and get the job done. And interestingly, I had the opportunity a month or so ago to do research with people who practice big A agile methodologies. And it was quite impressive to hear how they felt as an employee and a team member when they moved from a traditional organization to an organization that was using those agile methodologies, how much more energized and happy they were with their work and the people that they were working with, and being able to get their jobs done. So something to look at as you move forward. Ultimately, we're trying to set up a situation where you're going to be better able, through the redesign that you've done, to be able to adapt more quickly. And a lot of what we're looking at here is making sure that you've got the right skills in the right place at the right time. I'll move on. I just want to show you this slide that I was talking about, and you can take a look at this more when you get the deck. When Gartner did this research with 5,000 employees and figured out that these were the top sources of work friction, and when you have an opportunity to look at these quotes, I think that you will see that this sounds very familiar to you. And not that they're easy nuts to crack, but if you do, it can make a big difference in being able to respond to crises and to be able to take advantage of opportunities. Next slide, please. Building a strong ecosystem. This is another thing that came out of some of the lessons learned in the pandemic. Certifiers, especially in healthcare, worked with other organizations. So for instance, a medical specialty board would work with the medical society and work with the training programs in academic institutions and with other healthcare disciplines to share ideas, bring information about the COVID pandemic to their stakeholders as quickly as they possibly could. And they also have the opportunity to share insights as well. And so it's certainly something to think about as you go forward. And if you've got these relationships up front, if you've already been working together, it'll be that much stronger when you have a crisis to work together with. So of course, if you haven't already done so, or if there are others that you can think about that would be part of an ecosystem that could help you to respond, certainly proactively reach out to those. Think about the variety of entities that could ultimately be helpful in this process, that have shared interests and goals and are going to be compatible and working together, and helping to build this through having a very open and collaborative environment. And some of you may have examples yourselves of working with other organizations to help make things better for your candidates and your certificates, or the public that you were serving as well through the pandemic and through your credentialing process. I will cover the last of the 5 things that we talked about, and that is getting that crisis management plan right. Crisis management plans, many of them are a real snooze. It's kind of like reading a how-to manual for fixing your computer. It's not very interesting and very predictable. And I'm no expert on this, but I'll share my thoughts about this. And one of the things about it is, for instance, well, it says, well, you need on your crisis team your communications director, you need your insurance person, your legal person. So that's focusing solely on titles, but we really ought to be considering also the capabilities and insights that we need to be able to address the problem. So who are the smartest people that we can put on this program or problem or challenge or opportunity, regardless of whether they are in the plan or not and what their title is. Also, we've got to take into consideration the human factor in the crisis. And maybe that's not always written into the plan, but it's certainly a consideration. I mean, as we know from going through this pandemic, which has touched all of us in so many different ways, the people who have to help you deal with the challenge you've got and your stakeholders are experiencing the challenge too. And first and foremost, they're humans. And they need to have some stability and some direction to be able to go forward. And so empathy, transparency, and frequent communication is important. And if we didn't know that before, or we knew it before, it certainly was reinforced when you had to handle the pandemic. And so it's quite different than a lot of the traditional crisis management plans, which say, don't you dare say a word until you do X, Y, and Z, which is not to say that some of that isn't important, but we also have to balance that out with people need to know something and know that we're out there and not create a vacuum in which something worse could happen. Another important point is that there pretty much are ripple effects from every crisis. So here's a perfect example with the pandemic. We had this health crisis, and it kind of began as like, oops, now we're all going to have to work from home. How's that going to work? We better figure that one out quick. And then it was, oh no, we can't test. What in the heck are we going to do now? And oh boy, people are really going to be upset. Then it was, OMG, this is a long-term problem. How are we going to stay afloat if we can't test? Or if our volumes take a nosedive because people have lost their jobs. So one of the things as part of your crisis management planning is taking the planning to the next level of thinking about the many ways in which the crisis can ripple and impact your organization, ultimately with the idea that you're going to be in a better position to take steps to forestall or at least minimize some of these, and maybe we'll say secondary effects that might occur. So those are the 5 things that I thought might be things to think about putting into place based on what we learned. And do we have, I'm just looking to see, do we have more here related to these? Or Mark, did you want to get started on your remarks while I look through these?
Sure. And, these are really great, I think, observations. And because it's my guess that when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the crisis plans that some folks had in place didn't necessarily help them that much. All right, so we did promise as part of this discussion a few tips to help you bring agility or a sense of agility to your organization. So we're going to give you a few, and these are in no particular order of importance. The first one is really to get the clutter out of your governance documents. And when we talk about governance documents, we're talking about your articles or certificate of incorporation and your bylaws. A lot of times we see folks put policies into their bylaws, and then when it comes time to make a change, they have to amend the whole bylaws simply because they want to change one policy. Policies really belong in policy manuals and certification handbooks and employment handbooks. So to the extent that you can clean up your articles of organization, your bylaws, doing so would really go a long way in terms of helping your organization become or stay agile. Right. Another thing that you can check in your bylaws is your quorum requirement. Many jurisdictions have they allow the organization to set your own quorum requirements. So it may make sense to do that, particularly if you have a hard time finding individuals to serve on the board, finding individuals to serve on your committees. talk with talk with a governance consultant, talk with a legal consultant about what makes sense for you in terms of the quorum requirements, so that you're able to get decisions made and things done. Right. Tip number 2: cross-train your staff. And this isn't just because you need expertise across multiple disciplines, but who knows, right? We're in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. Who knows when you may not, have the particular resource or expertise at hand. How many times have you been trying to set up a conference call or been trying to have a conversation and had to say, well, we really need so-and-so to be part of this discussion, or we can't move forward with getting so-and-so's input. I understand that for many organizations, this may not be sort of something that's practical, but I think to the extent that you can, try and cross-train your staff. Okay, number 3, develop a volunteer pipeline. So, we're talking about quorum requirements. I mean, a lot of times you're unable to meet quorum requirements because you don't have the volunteers around to serve the organization. Not only does having a volunteer pipeline help you maintain the numbers that you need to make sure that things are moving forward, but also having a volunteer pipeline makes sure you have the diversity and allows you to create a diversity among your volunteers, so that when it's time to become agile or think from an agile perspective, you have other folks that can bring different, new, fresh ideas to how your organization can do that. Volunteers are a really critical, important piece of credentialing bodies, and so it's really important to have a pipeline. Tip number 4 is go green. So who here is still using paper certification applications, paper recertification applications? Who here is still requiring individuals to submit paper copies of their continuing education for an audit? Who here is still using paper when they're doing their item development meetings? Having paper means that you have to have somebody, you have to have a place for the paper to go, and you have to have somebody at that place for the paper to be processed. And so, it does impede or inhibit your agility somewhat if you're having paper processes in place. Now, I understand, again, these tips aren't going to work for everybody, right? Because in some cases, it is the best way for the organization to get something done. So, just keep that in mind, but, somewhat reducing the paper within your organization is going to allow you to then conduct operations from home, from remote locations, and is going to reduce the need for some sort of physical space. And then the last tip is really talking about contracts, and not just shortening your contract terms, but really thinking, really giving significant thought to how you're going to deal with your contracts moving forward, right? Two ways that you can shorten your contract terms. One is to make sure that the contract term is a term that's sufficiently short to be able to allow you to make regular decisions on whether that contract's the right way to go. Periods of 12 months are great. If you can't get sort of a shorter term, another way to build, sort of shortness into your contract is to get a termination for convenience provision built in, so that you can terminate, even though you may have a long-term contract, you can terminate the contract at some point that you've deemed appropriate to sort of move in a different direction. Of course, not all of these options are going to be available to you, but you can certainly think about, if they're not going to be available, you can think about other ways then to make sure that you have some agility in your contracts to be able to move when the time comes to do so. And you can also still budget, right? You can still budget. You can still budget using the terms of the contract, using the financial costs in the contract. You can still budget, and we know budget is just a guess, right? So you can certainly use contract terms in your budget, even though you may not expect to be in that contract for some significant portion after. So Lenore, that's it for tips. Did you want to try and answer these last few questions?
Well, I just want to be respectful of people's time marks. So let's confer on this. We're about 1 minute past 1 now. Do you want to make final remarks? And then we've got a couple questions we can respond to after the webinar individually.
Sure, that works.
All right. Did you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, so I don't have anything to recap other than, it's agility. I think given the uncertainty that we're facing, not just as an industry, but as a nation, as the global environment, has turned out. I mean, I think agility is going to be a really important characteristic for successful organizations moving forward. So, to the extent that you can take some of these things away and implement them into your organization, I think that's only going to serve you very well in the next few months, if not years, going forward.
I agree, and I think this session was a great segue into part 3 of this 3-part series. And we look forward to everybody joining us for that. Thank you so much for joining us. We know, especially now, time is at a premium. And for those of you that still had questions in the chat box that you would like to have answered, we'll be getting back to you for those as well.
Thank you, Mark and Lenora, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Managing Your Certification Program During the COVID Era and Beyond, Part 2, Managing Agility in the Face of Uncertainty. On behalf of Whiteford, Taylor & Preston, Knapp & Associates International, Inc., thank you for joining us today, and stay well.